Hi, and in this video we're going to look at how to composite CGI objects into a backplate. We'll concentrate just on a still image backplate for the time being, but this could be a still video. We're just going to work with still images because it's going to be quicker to render and everything like that. So the first thing to do is to make sure we set our renderer up. So let's just go to render settings and choose mental ray. And put it onto HD format, so we're using the right aspect ratio. Another thing that's always a good idea when you're doing post-production work is just to go to renderer setting, and down here where it says frame buffer type, make sure it says 32 bits per channel. The default sometimes comes up as 16 bits per channel, and that won't give you quite such a good quality render. So now that's set up, let's bring in our background image, which we can do with Alt-B to bring in the viewport configuration. And I'm going to click Use Files for the background image. I'm going to browse for the file, and I'm going to put my background in. And my background is made to the same size as HD video, so I don't really need to change this, but it's good practice just to take match bitmap there, and it means that the background image will always match the bitmap, and it won't stretch it to match the render size or the viewport size. Click Apply to Active View and OK, and now we can see that I've got the background image in place here. What I'm going to do now is use the Perspective Match tool to match the perspective of the viewport and the 3D scene. So go to the Utilities panel here, choose Perspective Match, and then choose Show Vanishing Lines. Now the vanishing lines here, you've got blue, green and red lines, and the blue, green and red correspond to X, Y and Z, so RGB is X, Y, Z, always in 3ds Max. So to make this line up, we basically pick up each of our lines here, our vanishing lines, and we put them into the scene to line up with things in the scene or in the background image which are in the same axes as the scene would be. So verticals are going to be Z, and you see I've made these quite long. It's a good idea to make them as long as possible because you get a more accurate positioning on the lines when they're longer. So I'm going to move the Z one in, the X one in, and you can see that as I change this it can make some quite drastic changes to the perspective. These will all normalize a little bit when they're all aligned up. I've just taken from the bottom there of that pillar to the bottom of that pillar as a horizontal line, and I'm going to take the back skirting board as another one. And then the green lines here I'm going to use to follow the markings on the floor. I'm just going to drag that one to there. Again, making them as long as possible so you get the best possible accuracy. And this one down to here. Okay, now that's a perspective match, and you can see straight away that the grid lines here do look like a perspective match, but they're not actually on the floor level or whatever. So I'm going to come out of perspective match mode now, and I'm going to draw in a box just here, just here, like that. And that box is probably way too small, very, very small. I'm going to make it to the same size as the door because I know how big the door is. The door is 160 centimeters wide and 195 centimeters high. And I'm just going to move that back into the scene to make it the right size. And you can't really use the gizmo very well from this angle, so I'm just going to use the Y controller here in the status bar And you can see as I move it back into the scene, you can see it's getting further and further away, and therefore it looks smaller and smaller. You can also see it's too high. Don't try and adjust the viewport at this point, because the viewport has been set up by perspective match. So now what you actually do is you actually take the whole door itself and you move it into position using the normal XYZ controls that you would use for anything else. Remember to move it further away to make it smaller, and then to just use the other tools to line it up. So a bit nearer. Don't be afraid to lift it up and down as well as in and out and left and right, because it is in fact just as important to get the height as it is to get the distance away. Okay, so I've put the door into place now. Now I'm just going to have a look at this in one of the perspective views, and you can see from this perspective view that the grid over here is much higher up than the door down here. So we knew the grid was floating anyway, but here, this is the bottom of the door here is the actual floor height that we want our floor to be at. So I'm just going to draw a plane in my scene, and I'm going to use the align tool just to align that to the door. So align, and then choose the door here, and I'm going to move it from in the Z direction so that the minimum point on my plane is also the minimum point on the door, and apply that. Okay. If I come back to here, just going to hide my grid. It's not a real grid, it was just my graphics card wasn't displaying a real grid, so I put a plane there earlier. Now you can see it actually looks like it's lying on the floor. We just need to make it a much more sensible size so it fits in the scene a little bit better. And there we can see now that I've now got a perspective match. I'll just put wireframe back on. Got a perspective match where things now look like they're sat in the scene, and this blue plane is now my floor plane, not the 0 point on the grid, which would be the normal situation for these for a 3ds Max scene. So I'm going to actually get this to the same size and position as my rug. So the rug is 230 by 180, and I'm going to bring that in just to line it up there. Well, maybe it wasn't 230 by 180, but let's get it to roughly the right size and roughly the right position. Okay, that's close enough. This floor plane here that I've put in over the top of the rug is going to be something to catch the shadows of the objects I put in the scene. So I don't want the shadows to fall on the shiny floor out here, I just want them to land on the rug, and this is close enough. I'm also going to put in the windows here, so if I just X-ray the door for a bit so I can see the windows a bit better, I'm going to create a plane to go on the windows. And this is a feature I'm going to use, this auto grid feature here is a feature I'm going to use when positioning anything in the scene now, because basically it just draws new objects on top of old objects. So I'm going to draw a plane onto the door here to try and mimic the shape and size of these windows. And I'm going to use these windows to catch reflections of the scene. See how big that is. Slightly bigger. Just turn off the wireframe so I can see the edges a bit better. It's actually pretty close. We can always adjust those again later. I'm just going to copy that across, shift and drag to there. I can make it an instance, so if I change the size of one, the other one will change as well. So I've got my windows in place like that. Those are going to catch reflections. At this point I can get rid of my door, so I'm just going to hide that for now. And you can see actually I do need to move them down just a little bit further. Not that far, about there. Yeah, you can see they're miles out, but we'll fix that a bit later. So I've now got a floor plane and two windows. Let's put some objects in the scene which we can actually use as well. So I'm going to put in one object here. Again, auto grid is on, so I'm going to draw onto the box, onto the rug there. I'm going to make this into a sphere that is 15 centimeters round, and then I'm just going to right click on the move tool here so I can move it up. I'm going to move it up 14.9 centimeters just so it looks like it's grounded. I might even move it up 14 centimeters just so it looks like it's grounded on the rug. I'm going to put a teapot in here. Now, if ever you're rendering teapots, always make them nice and smooth, so 10 segments, and always put a shell modifier on them, because otherwise you'll have bits of the teapot around the lid in particular which are see-through. So not outer, but in just 0.1 centimeters, so it's a millimeter thick. And again, I like to just move the teapot down just half a centimeter so it sits on the ground a bit better. That was up, wasn't it? Minus 0.5 centimeters, just to move it down so it's grounded quite nicely. I'm also going to put in, just because I like them, a torus knot. Again, move that up until it's just slightly under the rug. Let's position all these on the rug so that they're a little bit more logical. Like so. Let's get the material editor going. So, I'm going to apply material Autodesk Ceramic. Always get rid of these because I never use them. Just keep it nice and tidy. I'm going to make it a pink teapot, pinky purple colour. And I'll apply that to the teapot. I'm going to create a Autodesk metal. Get rid of those again. And I'm going to make that copper and apply that to my torus knot. And I'm going to put in just a general arc and design material. It's always a good idea to have a matte white object in the scene. Don't ever take this quite up to full value, so I always make it nearly white. Turn the reflectivity down to 0 here and apply that to the sphere. That's going to help me get the lighting correct in the scene. I don't know quite why that's turned out black. Let's just go to high quality and see if that fixes it. There we go. So I've now got 3 materials on there. Now the other objects need materials as well. So the rug here and the windows need special materials called matte shadow reflection materials. So let's grab material, mental ray, matte shadow reflection. I'm going to call this one rug MSR and apply that to the rug. And what that will do, you'll see when I render it, is that's going to catch the shadows from these without actually rendering in the scene itself, and that will make more sense when you see it. I'm going to get another one of these for the windows. Window. MSR. And for the windows don't have shadows, they don't receive AO, but they do receive reflections. And a bit further down they don't receive indirect illumination, so it's literally just that. And I will tweak that more later I'm fully expecting these to reflect in the windows, even though they're a long way away from it, because I'm pretty sure the perspective will not match up accurately enough to, because realistically I don't think they would reflect in the windows, but we'll see when we render it. So apply that to the windows. Even though they're instances, you have to apply the material to each instance. And let's give that a render just to see what it looks like. Okay, so if I just zoom in on these objects here, obviously there's no lighting in the scene, so there's nothing really to reflect properly in the teapot or the torus knot. You can just about see the reflections here in the windows, but the secret to the matte shadow reflection material comes in the alpha channel. If you click the alpha here, you can see that it has caught the shadows from those objects on the floor as a kind of grey alpha colour, and same for the reflections here, those are a kind of grey alpha colour as well. And what it means is that the shadows and the reflections will be a little bit see-through, whereas these objects, which are solid, are just pure white. Also, everything else in the scene, including the bits of the matte shadow reflection material that we can't see, are black, which means they are completely see-through. So the shadows here, where they're a little bit see-through, will allow a little bit of the RGB colour to bleed through into the image when we matte this over the top. So if I go back to the RGB, you can see that that colour is black. So this grey alpha is going to allow a little bit of black to bleed through, and it will look like a shadow. The reflection here has gone grey, and the reason it's gone grey is because it's going to be a little bit see-through. So it's going to allow a little bit of these colours here to bleed through, to overlay on top of the glass. So the glass will still actually be transparent. Now, that's the matte shadow reflection material, but the lighting is not set up yet. So to do that, we're going to use a light probe image. So to take a light probe image, you need to take multiple shots of a silver ball. This is just the top of a tensor barrier. Now normally you would take this from further away and you'd zoom the camera in because it gives a slightly more accurate light probe result, but also it means that the reflection of you and your camera are smaller in the picture and not so noticeable. When you're taking the photos, you need to make sure that you take photos at varying exposures. So you take one really light one, and that gives you some details in the darker areas of the scene. Then increasingly going darker and darker and darker until you get a very dark image like this one. Now you do the changes in exposure by having the camera in a fully manual mode, and you leave the f-stop value exactly where it is, because otherwise it will change the depth of field and will change the focus of the image. And you change the exposure by changing the shutter speed, making it quicker and quicker shutter speed. And the reason you want to go so dark is because then these patches of white where the lights are it gets a true representation of just how bright those are, because you can see that they're so much brighter than everything else in the scene. And really you should go until they're all but disappeared. Once you've got these images, these are the JPEG versions. If your camera is a decent camera, it will also take a raw image file format of each one, and the raw image file is the one we want because it's got a higher dynamic range. Now to get these into Photoshop, we take these into Photoshop and we turn them into a high dynamic range image, which we're going to use for lighting. And that is a very simple process. You go File, Automate, Merge to HDR, click that button, you browse to the files, you choose all the raw image light probes and OK that, and then you hit make sure that you have Attempt to automatically align source images ticked, and you do OK. And then you sit and wait for a while, and you'll see all sorts of things happen in your layers dialog as it loads in the images, rearranges them, and so on. Now when it's completed, it gives you a preview here of the high dynamic range image itself. You can see down here that it's worked out the exposure values for each of those images based on the metadata stored inside the photograph. And you can see that now I've got a exposure range from 5 EV or minus 5 EVs to plus 4 EVs, which is reasonable. You can go higher than that, obviously, if you've got even darker and brighter images, That gives you a better HDR image again. You don't need to change any of these, but it's a good idea to go in here and change mode to 32-bit, because then it gives you the full dynamic range of the image. And then OK. Now here's your high dynamic range image. What we need to do is we need to crop this down to the size of the light probe. So I'm just going to unlock the background layer, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to draw a elliptical marquee close to the main object there. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit actually, so I can see it a bit more closely. Now then what we want to do is we want to make this selection exactly fit around the edge of the sphere. So go to Select, Transform Selection. Note that this is a different tool to the standard Transform tool. Right, so we're not using the Transform tool, we're transforming the selection. And then we just bring that right in until it touches the edge or edges of the light probe. Like so. The one at the bottom we can't really see because it's got this stand in, so we're just going to adjust the height so that it follows the sphere on the way round. This one needs to come in slightly more. It is just a case of using your grade 1 eyeball to get this right. And then when you're happy, tick the tick. Now we need to get rid of everything else, so do Control-Shift-I, and that will invert the selection. So now instead of having the sphere selected, we've got everything but. Hit the delete key, and that will get rid of everything in the scene, and then you can deselect with Control-D. Let's just zoom back out so we can see that fully with Control-0. What I need to do now is trim that to size, so I go Image, Trim. Just choose the top left pixel color, which is white, and what it will do is it will trim everything that isn't white from the image, like so. We're nearly there, we just need to make sure that this is exactly square. So the last final thing is we just go to Image Size, and we make sure that the pixels are going to read the same. So it says 834 and 824. Make sure you unlock the connection here by turning off Constrain Proportions, or if you're on a newer version of Photoshop you can click the little lock there, and I'm going to make them both 824. Where it says Resample Image, I always just put that to Bicubic Automatic, and OK that. Gives you a little bit of a shake, and now it's a perfectly square image, and we can save that. Save as. And I literally just go in there and I make it into an EXR file, and you can see there's the one I saved earlier, light probe final. So we take our light probe image into the scene to light our CGI objects the same as the original footage was lit. So to do that we go to Create, Lights, and although in Mental Ray we should always use the photometric lights, in this particular scenario we go to Standard and we choose a skylight. And that's because the skylight is basically going to be a holder for our HDRI image. So now I've got the skylight in there. Let me go to the Modify panel, and in here, which is the skylight map, we need to put in something called an environment probe chrome ball shader. We put that in there, and then we bring our material editor back in. And we're going to drag this into the material editor so we can edit it. Double click. Now this is the key here. This is where we browse for our HDRI light probe image. Just be aware that while everything else in 3ds Max, if you've got these little map slots sticking out the back here, that one corresponds to this button here. On this environment probe chrome ball image, you should not use that one. You should browse for it manually here. If you browse for it, go into your Scene Assets Images, which is where I've got my light probe EXR. I'll open that one up and put it in, and you see it appears there. It doesn't appear as an extra map stuck on the end. It's a little bit odd for those of you who are used to the slate editor, but that's how it works. Now that is all you need to do to light the scene for objects with no reflections. So let's just render that now and see what the difference is. This was the one we rendered just now, so I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm going to go in and render again. First thing you can see is it's a lot darker than the image that we rendered before. That's because before we were just supplying it with bright white light. This time we're supplying it with lighting data from the light probe, so you can see it's hugely darker. But look at some of the detail. So straight away on this matte finish ball here, you can see now I've got a complex lighting system set up. And you can see this even more clearly if I look at the shadows. And I compare the shadows to this one. The shadows from a skylight are basically ambient occlusion, so you can see that it's just evenly spread all around. Whereas now, you can see the shadows are quite complex. In fact, you can see that they come from multiple light sources, because there's a shadow there, shadow there, shadow there, and a shadow there. And that ties up with the 4 spotlights on the ceiling. So the lighting is much more complex, but the image is darker. So what we're going to do now is we're going to composite that into After Effects to see how to use the image. I'm just going to set the render set up so we actually save the file, because we haven't done that yet. So choose Files, Save, Render Output, and I'm going to call this teapot test. Save it out as an EXR file. There we go. And save. And here, make sure again, just like we did in the renderer window, that this says full float 32 bits per channel. Okay. Just going to render that again quickly. Let's go to After Effects. So I'm going to import those. Import file. And I'm going to choose my background with rug and my teapot EXR and open that up. Drag them both down here into the layers. Okay, that. And I'm going to put the teapot test on top of the background. Now, because we're working with 32-bit image formats, change your project settings, which you can do just from this little button here. Change your project settings to 32 bits per channel, just like everything else we've done. But you also need to change the working space to sRGB, and click Linearize Working Space, and OK that. Now, you won't see much change here. It just means that any edits you do will tie together nicely. Now you'll see the render is much darker, and that's because there's no connection between the exposure of the backplate and the exposure of our light probe image. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the exposure of our teapot test EXR to brighten it up until it looks like it matches. So choosing the teapot test EXR, come over to your effects and presets and type in expo. Choose exposure down here, the color correction exposure. It'll say 32 there because it's suitable for 32-bit image formats. Double click on it and it will apply it to your active layer. I'm going to turn the exposure up until the white ball, which is, remember, is the matte finish object, looks like it might be lit about the right amount. And again, just by eye. So I'm going to put it like so for now. That's got an exposure value of 3.7. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that we're going to boost our light probe image brightness by that amount in 3ds Max. So 3.7 is an exposure value. To get the calculator up, we do 2 to the power 3.7 equals 12.99. So it's a factor of 13 is the factor we need. Go back to 3ds Max. Go back to our material editor. And here on our Chrome Mirror Ball Image Environment Probe Chrome Ball thing, we're going to put in a multiplier factor of 13 and re-render it. Overwrite the existing teapot. Let's go back to After Effects. If it doesn't automatically reload in, just right click on your EXR and choose Reload Footage. And you can see now obviously it comes in stupidly bright. So let's go in and just get rid of our exposure thing here, and we should see that this ball matches the colouring that we wanted in our scene originally. Note that the shiny objects don't look right yet. That's because we haven't fixed that. But look at these beautiful shadows it's created on the rug. It makes it look like it's been lit from those spotlights above. Now in the background you'll notice the reflection is also there, and you can see I haven't quite got my window size correct, so I can go in and I can tweak that value a bit later by changing the size of the window. You can also tone down the reflections. We're going to do that a bit later. Let's finish sorting the lighting out first. So I'm just going to leave After Effects open, go back to 3ds Max, and we're going to put in the things that are needed to make everything else work. So at the moment the reflections aren't working, and that's because when the light comes in it hits this metal object and it flies off to a particular direction, and all it can see is the black of the kind of CGI environment around it, and it reflects black. It does obviously reflect the other CGI objects. You can see the ball reflecting there in the side, in the metal side. You can also see the ball reflecting in the teapot, but we need it to be a bit better than that. So let's take our environment map. I just pressed 8 to get that up. I'm also going to put my chrome ball image into the environment map. Let's render that. Right, so what you can see now is the environment map is the chrome ball image. Instead of being a flat two-dimensional circular image, it has now been stretched over an infinite sphere around the outside, which means that in all directions it's returning the correct reflections. So if I zoom in on the reflective object here, you can see as it finishes rendering that you've got all the reflections from the spotlights and everything else in the scene that you would have before. In the teapot you can see that that's particularly nicely lit. Okay. We do have this problematic background, and that is where the very edges of our chrome ball image have been stretched beyond belief to the very far edge of our environment map, and it looks like something out of a bad 1970s Doctor Who episode. So we need to get rid of that, because you should always composite with a black background. So to do that we go back to our material editor here, and I'm going to put in a mental ray environment background switcher. Now if I look at this, you can see that it's got two map slots basically, a background map slot and an environment map slot. The background map slot is what the renderer will return when the rays of light come out of the camera and they hit the environment map directly. The environment and reflections is what the rays of light will see if they hit the environment map after reflecting or refracting in the scene. So what we need to do is we need to feed our chrome ball image into the background here. You can see it's appeared in the map slot there. So what this does is it means that when a ray of light hits our metal object and goes off into space, it will see our chrome ball image. When our renderer looks out and sees the environment map directly, it will return a black transparent pixel, which is exactly what we want. So we don't want this to be our environment map. We want this one to be our environment map. So drag that back out over the top of the one there, and now you can see that that says environment background switcher. If I re-render that now, you can see we have a black background, but we still get the lovely reflections in the teapot and in our copper coloured torus knot. Let's finish rendering. Let's have a look in After Effects. Just go back to my project, reload the teapot, and you can see now these reflections look much more realistic. The only issue we got now is that the underside here is very dark. Same for the teapot, same for this as well. All the undersides are really dark and artificial. And that's another reflection issue. That's because when the light hits here and bounces down, it bounces onto our matte shadow reflection material, and that is black. So what we actually want it to reflect is we want it to reflect this bit of rug, which is part of our background image. So we can do that relatively simply too. I'm just going to go to my rug matte shadow reflection material that we had earlier, and here there's a thing called camera mapped background, and that's returning a black transparent pixel, which is what happens when the renderer sees the matte shadow reflection material. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it to see the background image by putting it in the map slot here. So I pick that, I go to bitmap, and I put in my background, and you can see now that that is connected up. Just double click on the bitmap here, and rather than texture you want to switch it to environment and screen, and that means that it will map onto the thing here as a camera map, onto the matte shadow reflection material as a camera map. If I render that now, you can see that it's literally picked up the rug parts of the background image, and it's camera mapped them onto my matte shadow reflection material, and you can see that this dark underside has disappeared, and we've got again a much more natural looking thing. In the shiny object we get reflections, in the non-shiny object we get bounced light, and it looks amazing. The only problem is that it's still not a black background. So to make it black when we look straight at it, but this rug colour when we're looking at it through a reflection, we need another background switcher. So this time we go back to our material editor. We're going to get another background switcher. I'm going to feed that into my camera mapped slot. I'm going to feed this into the environment slot, and then re-render. And straight away, even before it's finished rendering, you can see that the effect is much more realistic. We've got all the reflections, we've got the bounce light, and everything is bouncing back the rug colour, which is what we wanted. Let's go back to After Effects, reload. There we go. Now we've got a very realistic final image. So lastly, we just need to fix this issue here with the reflections. So I'll zoom right in. We can see that the plane that I've used on the back here isn't wide enough to reflect the full amount of the teapot. And you've got the same here. There's just the edge of the ball sticking out there. It's not quite wide enough there. These are instances of each other, so if I change one to the correct width, the other one will be the correct width too. So I go back to 3ds Max. It's just literally a case of selecting this. We'll make it from 11.4, let's go up to 12, let's go up to 13 centimeters wide, and do a quick re-render. In fact, we don't need to re-render the whole lot. Let's just set up a region render for the bit we're interested in here, and render that. That's going to create a new EXR. If I reload that in now, you can see that it hasn't rendered these, but it's rendered this bit here, and you can see it's wider, but it's in slightly the wrong position. So let's go back, move this very slightly in the X, and I'm going to just nudge it with this. Oh, that's a big nudge. Let's try it anyway. Let's see what that renders like. Go back to After Effects, reload. It's much closer. And you can see you can keep going on obviously like that. Let's just go back to 100%. Yeah, you can see that that size is much better. You could tweak it a little bit more and more if you wanted. The other thing is that that's a very bold reflection for something so far away. So you can change the fall off of the reflection material as well. If I go back to the material editor, choose my window, map shadow reflection material. Under reflections here, you can see the fall off is 2. Well, you want the fall off to be 2 really for it to be realistic. So what we do though is we set the distance, the maximum distance, to be a certain distance away, and it means anything beyond that distance won't reflect. I'm going to set it to 1000 centimeters so that we can see how much more faint it is. If I just duplicate that. So we got that one there. Re-render. And look how much more faint that reflection is now. If I go back to After Effects and reload that, you can see it's much fainter, which is a good thing. So I'll just re-render the whole scene again, turn it from region back to view, and render. So you can see I've got the whole thing there. There's a very slight reflection of the teapot. It's very see-through, so you can see right through the window. There is another part of this image which we haven't really considered yet, and that is the reflective floor. And I think that these objects would probably just about reflect in the floor at the front here from the angle we're at, so we can test that out as well. But I'm also going to put another object at the back here to reflect in the floor, and that will also show that when it's closer to the window it will reflect in the window more strongly. So let's create a new object. Just going to create some text point. Let's just modify that. Nice big hello to all my viewers. So let's make it a bit fatter than that. I'm going to align that down to my baseline as well. So that's on the floor. It's nice and near the back. I can make it even bigger than that because I want it to reflect in the... Oh, it's fatter, even bigger than that because I want it to reflect in the windows quite obviously. Something like this. I'm just going to reduce that way. Okay, so we've got some text in there. It still needs to move a bit more forwards, doesn't it? Let's put a material on it. Let's make this blue. Matte finish. Okay. Now we need something on the floor to reflect the writing and also to reflect right to the front, so I'm going to put on a large plane here. I'm going to start it on top of this plane, but then I'm just going to make it much bigger. and much wider. I'm going to move it back until it's underneath the hello. The fact that it's behind there is not hopefully going to be an issue, because the bits you can't see should render in black anyway. I'm also just going to put that very slightly down, so it's below the mat. I'm going to bring this very slightly down as well, because I don't want the reflections to be over the top of the mat, so if that's down underneath, that's good. I'm going to bring another copy of this forward to do the front of the scene. Just make that a little bit narrower. All their instances. Just make that a little bit narrower there, because we don't need it to be quite so wide. Let's create a matte shadow reflection material for the floor. And similar to the windows, we need it not to receive shadows, not to receive AO, not to receive indirect illumination, but to receive reflections. But I want to make the reflections completely non-transparent, because I don't want to see the reflections in the floor behind it. So I change my reflection colour to pure white, and they're completely non-transparent. And also, because it's not 100% glossy like a piece of glass, I'm going to knock the glossiness down to about 0.9, just to make it slightly more blurry. And then I'll apply that to my two new floor planes. Let's do another render. You can see as it renders already that it's rendering a nice reflection in the floor, except for the gap between the I do need to make these planes a bit bigger, because there's a gap between the two planes there. You can see as well that the reflection in the window, particularly here, where you can just see the teapot, is quite faint, but the actual lettering is much more bold than the you can see that as well here. It's, the teapot is much more faint because it's grey, and the reflection of the thing that's nearer is much more bold because it's lighter grey, which means it'll stand out more. So let's just, and you can see the reflection is actually a little bit blurred as well. So let's just cancel that and make those two planes big enough. Set the overlap. I should be able to render that again. Reload that back into After Effects. And you can see we have a reflective floor. Obviously I've made the reflective floor there too low with respect to the mat. Needed to be just underneath it, not that far beneath it. But you can see that the reflections in the floor are very good. Reflections in the window are now a bit more visible. And overall, apart from that little gap on the front there, it's not bad. So let's just try and fix that quickly. Just going to move this up so it really is literally just underneath the other matte. So that blue plane there is the matte. This purple plane here is the reflective floor. Move that down very slightly because I like to have them just intersecting so that it works better. Let's see how that works. Oh, I'm rendering a different view, that's fine. Still not quite close enough. I can probably get over that by a little bit more cheating. I'm going to have to convert this plane. Let's make it into a single poly. I'm just going to convert this plane to an editable poly. Grab those verts there. And move them down till they literally almost touch that. And give that a render again. Reload it into After Effects. Still too close. Not close enough. Let's just move that back a bit. Re-render. You can keep doing that until you get it exactly spot on. I'm going to stop there because there's no point in you watching me tweaking this and tweaking it some more. Hopefully that's given you all the information you need to produce a fully rendered composited image.